how do we look at what the landscape is? We're going to take a snapshot of here's all the information we know right now, and then we're going to analyze what's the best strategy and what makes the most sense. Hopefully there won't be a winery using the exact name for the exact thing, and if that's a problem, then you have to face up to it and maybe pick a new name. But as my point being that there's a lot of other reasons to do a search and a lot of other great information you can get from investigating. And then we're going to cover in the selection process, that's the next step, is what are we going to select? How are we going to, narrow it down to what we want to protect, who we want to be, and what is it? And we're going to cover something called the brand dream team, okay? And the brand dream team and the continuum of trademarks. And this may sound like it's a little boring lawyerly, but I think it's really important and it's very, very helpful because it's where 90% of the lawsuits come from in trademarks, is clients who get wedded, number one, to a brand that's not very strong and they can't protect it. And then they end up throwing money after trying to protect something that really is an uphill battle, okay? Or if someone had just shared this concepts with them, they might have chosen something a little bit differently that was easier for them to defend as well as to stave off other people. So I'm going to run through those real briefly and give you kind of a couple of examples. We call this the types of mark and the continuum. A continuum means there's no exact point, it's just a continuous movement towards a certain destination. And the continuum goes from strong to weak. The stronger marks are marks that you can protect easily. The weak ones you can barely protect at all. Okay, so we want to stay on the stronger side of the continuum, which is where the golden, I represent that in your handout by the golden eggs. I call them the disappearing golden eggs. So that the stronger marks are ones that you'll be able to protect because no one else is using them. So I like to talk about, one of my favorites is the coined. The coined is probably the strongest of all. A coined mark is one that didn't exist before. It's a word that's made up. Anybody know what a good coined mark might be? One of my favorites is, maybe you'll recognize it by the tagline. See if anybody can recognize this one. The original celebrated curiously strong peppermint. Altoids, exactly. And I love to use that example because Altoids is one of the oldest known trademarks. It goes back to the 1800s in England. And it's a word that didn't exist, it was made up, okay? There's lots of others. Kodak is a great example. Xerox is a very, very famous coined arbitrary mark. Now, the challenge with those kinds of marks is even though they're good, and I don't think you'd ever have this problem in the wine industry, but coined marks can become ubiquitous and associated with the term or the product which is sold. One of the famous companies, Xerox, they have literally spent millions and millions of dollars in advertising over the last 20 years to prevent the word from Xerox getting absorbed into the English language. So they spend a lot of time teaching people with ads, don't let our trademark go the way of the zipper. The word zipper used to be a trademark, as did escalator, as did cellophane. Those are words that started out as trademarks, but they got absorbed into the English language because it was a new product and the trademark became the name for the product itself, okay? Pardon? Google that's a great example. That hasn't happened in a courtroom yet for Google, but people are using it in the vernacular, say, to go Google something, okay? Now, there's other aspects of what they do that would not be just generic, but when you talk about search engine, I think they have a problem. I agree with you. And that's something that's very hard to overcome, and I think Xerox has come closer to it than anybody. But actually, there's an example I won. They're a little bit hard to read, but they're in your handout under the coined mark example. I just did a little, in anticipation of getting together today, I went to the store and looked up some of your local brands to see, and just get some examples. I thought Sculpt was an interesting example of what's close to being a coined mark. It's not completely unmade up, but what it looks to me like has happened is somebody took the two words, terra for land and sculpt, which is the notion of, I guess, sculpting the land with the vineyards, and put those two together and made what I think is a pretty distinctive trademark. Okay, so that's an example of something that's sort of made up. Our second kind of mark is something that's called arbitrary. Now these are, you can't go wrong with an arbitrary mark if you pick it. I mean, the most famous arbitrary mark in the world right now is Apple. Okay, an arbitrary mark is when you take an ordinary object or an ordinary concept, generic term is what I'm referring to, a generic term, and apply it arbitrarily to unrelated goods or services. So that's what Apple did when it applied the word Apple to computers and to music. So a couple of examples I saw that I thought were interesting that I've shared with you under arbitrary marks is there's one called Gray Wolf, and Gray Wolf has a picture of a wolf. Well, a gray wolf has nothing to do with wine. Okay, that is clearly, but yet a gray wolf is an animal in nature. They've arbitrarily applied the term gray wolf to a label for selling wine. So then the next, we're going to go on the continuum. This is not our whole class, so we're going to kind of move through this. But the next ones are suggestive and descriptive. If something is suggestive, it's one of the strongest marks there is. But I represent this with a guy walking on a tightrope because it's like walking a fence. If you land on one side of the fence, the term is suggestive. If you land on the other side of the fence, it's descriptive. And the best way to understand that might be an example. I have a client who lives here in Peach Canyon. She's not in the wine business, wonderful woman named Denise Lynn, and she's been an author. She's written about 18 books over the years, and her first book she ever wrote was over 25 years ago about feng shui, you know, where they organize your house. She was the first person to ever write a book in English about feng shui. And about 7, 8 years ago, her publisher referred her to me because she had a group of students who had gone through this program regarding feng shui. It was a training program, quite an extensive one, 6-week program called Interior Alignment. And, you know, she'd never registered the name. And she came to me for some other reasons related to that, but we started talking, and I said, what do you mean you've never registered your name? And she said, well, you know, I went to a lawyer a number of years ago, and the guy said I couldn't protect it because it was not protectable as a trademark. And I actually took issue with that, and I said, I don't think that's the case at all. It seems to me like it's one of the best names I've ever heard of because it's suggestive. Suggestive names are great because they suggest what the product might be, but they don't tell you what the product might be. And by far, that is the biggest mistake new brand owners make. They want to describe what they do, which is fine. It's great to describe what you're selling, but don't do it in your trademark. Do it in your marketing and advertising materials, okay? It's like a good example might be hotels.com. Of course, we know you sell hotels reservations at hotels.com, but that's a great domain name, but it's not a distinctive trademark, okay? But going back to Denise's example, I said, no, I think it's suggestive because what do you think of when you think of interior alignment? Do you think of feng shui? It doesn't describe feng shui, does it? You think, well, it's something to do with the interior. Is it inside me? Is it inside the house? What is it? And it's aligning something. Am I aligning the brakes on my car? Am I aligning, what is it, right? So it makes you wonder. That's exactly what a great suggestive trademark does. It leaves you wanting to know more, okay? So I was very proud of this. I said, we're going to file your trademark and you're going to get it. And it turns out there's only 15% of all trademark applications ever filed go through without any office action whatsoever. The other 85% at least receive an initial refusal. Interior alignment not only got approved, it got approved with no office action whatsoever. So after that, you know, that was, Denise became my good client and my good friend. So, you know, that's just to give you a little bit of, and the descriptive, and why is the descriptive thing we're going to avoid? Okay, and again, you probably don't have too much of that here, but we're going to see a couple of examples where you'll see where it gets to be close in specific areas. When something is not what's called inherently distinctive, and that is a legal term, if it's not inherently distinctive, you cannot protect it without proof of acquired distinctiveness or what they call secondary meaning. Okay, that's a fancy words. What the heck does it mean? It means that if you have to sue somebody, you have to spend an extra $500,000 before you can sue them. Because you might have a piece of paper from the trademark office on a secondary register, I call this the false sense of security. You know, you think you've got something, but then when you find out you have to protect it and enforce it against someone, the burden of proof is you have, before you can walk in the courtroom and actually sue somebody successfully, you have to prove that the public associates that name with your company and your business, okay? That's a high burden for a lot of companies. Now, if you've been in business for 100 years and you're like U-Haul, okay, there's a great example. U-Haul is not a strong name, okay, but it's been in business for so many years and it's nationwide and they have spent millions in advertising. They could probably walk in and prove what we call secondary meaning or acquired distinctiveness, okay? But when you get in the wine business, you have to be careful because so many of these wineries use the same prefixes or the same suffixes. And, you know, I'll show you where that gets to be, those become what we call weak marks. They aren't completely descriptive, but they're using a term that is so overused within the industry that it becomes very weak, okay? Very weak to protect.